Hey, remember that scene in Empire Strikes Back where Luke has to go into this cave? He's training with Yoda, and he has to go in and essentially he has to encounter the dark side, and he sees and fights Darth Vader. But then when he chops the head off and the sort of helmet is broke open, he sees his own face inside. And I remember seeing this when I was like 10 years old at the theater and just having my tiny little mind blown by this. It's very interesting that the themes in Star Wars are so closely linked to Jungian psychology. So George Lucas sort of never apologized or made a mystery of the fact that Carl Jung and Jung's ideas about archetypes had a huge influence on him, probably through the mediating influence of mythology scholar Joseph Campbell. But in today's episode of Monsterology, I want to actually look at some monsters that Carl Jung himself talks about. And we'll see this sort of bear monster and then a dragon monster, and talk a little bit about how did Jung and Jungian psychology envision and understand monsters, and why that's had sort of a big influence on the way we think about monsters in contemporary society. Okay, welcome. This is the first image that we're going to work on. It's a digital drawing of this bear monster that Jung describes. And then I did a traditional charcoal drawing of this dragon with a female character here who, in the dream, has no face. And so that's why there's sort of a blanked out face there. I'm showing you the actual rendering technique here on the iPad using the Procreate software and the iPencil, and I like to do like a mixture of sort of like digital techniques and also show you some old school charcoal and oil and traditional art techniques, so you're going to see both. This is kind of fun. I bought this little figurine which is good for anatomy drawing. You can sort of pose this thing and then it helps you to draw your figures fairly accurate. And here I'm just showing you a rendering technique. Let me tell you a little bit about the story that we're basically illustrating here, and a little bit about Jung's theories. Many people are familiar with Jung's idea of archetypes. I'm going to read to you a couple of interesting passages from Jung's book, The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, which is a collection of many of his works. And in this section, he's talking about the psychological aspects of the chore, which is sort of like the damsel in distress, the young maiden archetype. And he says, quote, "Since for years I have been observing and investigating the products of the unconscious, namely dreams, fantasies, visions, and delusions of the insane, I have not been able to avoid recognizing certain regularities, that is, types." He then goes on to say that he uses the word motif, and eventually he comes up with the idea that they are archetypes. And the archetypes that he identifies are the shadow, and this one's really relevant for the example of Luke Skywalker that I mentioned at the beginning. And also the wise old man is another archetype. This is something you'll see in many mythologies and stories and movies. Also the archetype of the child, the archetype of the mother, and then the mother splits into two versions. One is the primordial earth mother, and the other is the sort of daemon or sort of angelic superhero mother. And then the maiden, and then he has two others. One is anima, which is the female presence within men, and animus, which is the male presence within women. And he basically goes through these stories in particular in this text of sort of mother figures and daughter figures, sort of working together, working against each other. It's based in a way on the sort of Greek mythology. You may recall there's the story of Demeter. She has union with Zeus, and they produce Chore, or Persephone. And Persephone is actually stolen. Actually, I think Zeus trades her or makes a bargain with Hades to take her as a wife. And so Hades comes and takes Persephone. And, the mother Demeter is so upset by this that Zeus says, okay, you got to give our daughter back to her mother, once a year. And so it creates this sort of archetypical relationship between mothers and daughters that Jung is interested in. You see it repeated, he thinks, in many stories in mythology, and we can think about in monster films too. You'll see this kind of stuff where the young woman is put in some terrible distress and is possibly a sacrificial victim. Sometimes the mother then can save the daughter character, or sometimes the mother's the cause of the problem. And what Jung is really interested in here is this sort of larger category of the self, which he calls the supraordinate self. So he thinks too many people have been focused on the self as the ego, which is your sense of your subjectivity, who you think you are, your personality. But actually your supraordinate self is the larger, holistic picture of who you are. Your ego is just sort of a part of this larger whole. And this larger whole contains both really positive and really negative dimensions, in particular the unconscious. And the unconscious can't be seen directly. You can't sort of look directly into your unconscious. You can only see it through objectified projections. So you put things out into the world, objects, creatures, symbols. So for example, monsters or heroes and gods are actually projections from our unconscious. And then we interact with those symbols, and it really teaches us something about who we are deep down. This can be gotten at through what Jung calls the active imagination, where you just, like I'm doing here, you draw, or you might make music, or dream, or otherwise try to engage this kind of active imagination where the rational parts of yourself are kind of shut off temporarily, and then these unconscious elements can sort of emerge. And so he tells a couple of stories in this text where he's interviewing a patient, and this particular patient is patient Y, and she basically is having these dreams. And so the first dream she has, she says, quote, "I am wandering over a great mountain. The way is lonely, wild, and difficult. A woman comes down from the sky to accompany and help me. She is all bright with light hair and shining eyes. Now and then she vanishes. After going on for some time alone, I notice that I have left my stick somewhere and must turn back to fetch it. To do this, I have to pass a terrible monster, an enormous bear. When I came this way the first time, I had to pass it, but then the sky woman protected me. Just as I am passing the beast and he is about to come at me, she stands beside me, and at her look the bear lies down quietly and lets us pass. Then the sky woman vanishes." So here, that's the end of the subject's or the patient's sort of report. And here Jung says, we have a maternally protective goddess related to bears, a kind of Diana. The sky woman is the positive. The bear, or the monster in this case, is the negative aspect of the superordinate personality, which extends the conscious human being upwards into the celestial and downwards into the animal regions. So according to Jung then, our monsters and our gods, in this case our goddesses, are both within us. And so the patient is actually sort of revealing these two parts of herself. And then he tells the story that I'm illustrating now, which is she reports to him another dream, and in this case it's a dragon. She says she has a dream in which there's a painting or picture, and in that picture it shows a dragon with its neck stretched out over the whole picture, and especially over a girl who is in the dragon's power and cannot move. For as she moves, the dragon, which can make its body big or little at will, moves too, and when the girl wants to get away, it simply stretches out its neck over her and so catches her again. Strangely enough, the girl has no face, at least I couldn't see it. That's end quote. That's how the patient sort of relates the story to Jung. And he adds a note there himself. He says, in the second picture, here he's referring to this one of the dragon, the maiden is portrayed as the innocent victim of the monster. Just as before there was a relationship of identity between the sky woman and the bear, so here the young girl and the dragon, which in practical life is often rather more than just a bad joke, here it signifies a widening of the conscious personality, i.e., through the helplessness of the victim on the one hand and the dangers of the dragon's might on the other. end quote. So what Jung is doing is sort of saying, look, our monsters are basically parts of ourselves that we're afraid to look at or that we can't see directly. And we sort of, in a clumsy way, we put them out into culture and we have stories about them and they tell us about our deepest fears, but also they show us that some of the darkest, deepest, frightening stuff is part of our shadow self, the parts of the unconscious that are aggressive, irrational. He doesn't think this is all bad. He thinks this is part of the operating system that human beings have. He's not sort of naive about this. But it does sort of remind us that there's the story of the unconscious that's going through all of the history of monsterology. In the early days, with Plato, the unconscious was sort of, you could see it referred to in the Republic, where he talks about the tyrant's soul. When the tyrant, acts, they're basically almost like a drunkard. The dreaming mind proceeds to rape, pillage, and burn whatever it wants before it sobers up. And then you get to sort of Freud and Jung, and for them, the unconscious is sort of a subjective state that contains the Darwinian, impulses within it. And Jung calls these archetypes. And in both cases, the sort of ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. In other words, you and I as individuals repeat in our mind the sort of mental architecture, the ideas, the archetypes that the whole species evolved. So even though it's sort of confused, this is sort of the view. And then sort of in the 1970s and 80s, up through the 90s, you got sort of consciousness 3.0, which is developed by philosophers like Michel Foucault and Deleuze-Guattari. For them, the unconscious and its mechanisms are the effects of historical and cultural production. They're not just innate Darwinian forces. They're actually produced by culture. And now I think you've got sort of a mishmash of all this. And you've got evolutionary psychology suggesting again that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. And I think this is just a fascinating way in which we think about monsters in our contemporary world. We understand, even if it's vaguely, that the monsters are us, and that we sort of project them out into the world in order to sort of conquer them and train them. And so this is sort of happening way back in the Star Wars film, and I think it's still alive and well in contemporary monster films and literature. So if you like that kind of thing, please hit the subscribe button and come back for more content, and I'll see you next time. All right, take care.